when billionaire Grayson Merritt stood in his own kitchen and watched his 7-year-old daughter, Poppy, hand a peanut butter sandwich to the new housekeeper instead of to him, he realized something had gone very wrong. Not with Poppy, but with himself. It had been 3 years since his wife, Catherine, passed away. 3 years of early morning meetings, late-night conference calls, and a daughter who'd learned to tie her own shoes because her father was always on the phone when she needed help. Grayson ran Merritt Capital, one of the most respected private equity firms in Toronto, and he was very good at it. He could restructure a failing company in 6 weeks. He could read a balance sheet the way other men read a novel. What he could not do, what he'd never quite managed, was figure out how to raise a little girl on his own. Poppy was 7, with her mother's dark eyes and a gap between her front teeth that made her lisp slightly when she said the word strawberry. She was the kind of child who remembered every single thing you ever said to her and would bring it up again at the worst possible moment. She had strong opinions about the color of her rain boots, the proper way to fold a napkin, and whether or not Grayson had actually listened when she was talking to him, which, she informed him regularly, he had not. The housekeeper's name was Rosalind Okafor. She had arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, recommended by the agency his assistant had contacted. References impeccable, background check clean. She was 29, with short natural hair and an unhurried way of moving through a room that Grayson found mildly irritating, not because it was wrong, but because it suggested a kind of contentment he hadn't felt in years. She wore simple clothes. She did not try to impress him. The first thing she did when she met Poppy was crouch down to eye level and say, "That's a very serious dinosaur on your shirt. What kind is it?" Poppy had looked at her with great suspicion. "Ankylosaurus, the one with the club tail?" Poppy's eyes went wide. "You know about the club tail?" "I grew up with 2 younger brothers," Rosalind said. "I know more about dinosaurs than I ever wanted to." Poppy had decided in that exact moment that Rosalind was acceptable. Grayson had not yet formed an opinion. He was already running late for a call with his partners in Vancouver. The weeks went on. Rosalind cooked simple dinners that Poppy actually ate, which was remarkable given that Poppy had refused everything except pasta and cheese for the better part of a year. She packed Poppy's lunch with the sandwich cut diagonally because, as Poppy had apparently explained on day 2, triangles taste better, it's just a fact. She helped with homework without doing it for her, which Poppy found annoying, but Grayson, overhearing from the hallway, found quietly impressive. He barely saw her. That was the arrangement, more or less. She arrived before he left in the morning. She had dinner ready when he got home. They exchanged brief logistical notes. "Poppy needs new snow boots. There's a form for the class trip that needs signing," and that was the extent of it. He paid her well. He treated her like a professional. He considered this adequate. It was his mother, Vivienne, who first suggested the idea. She brought it up over Sunday dinner in late November, at her house in Forest Hill, sitting across from Grayson with the particular expression she used when she was about to say something she knew he wouldn't like. Vivienne Merritt was 71, formidable, and deeply invested in the social architecture of her son's life. She had handled her own grief after Grayson's father died by redoubling her involvement in everyone else's business, and she was very good at it. "You need a wife," she said, which was not a new statement from her. What was new was what came next, and I've spoken to a few people. There are several women I'd like you to meet. Accomplished women, appropriate women. Grayson set down his fork. "Mom, Poppy needs a mother figure," Vivienne continued. "Someone who can be a proper partner to you. Someone of standing. Poppy has a wonderful woman in her life right now." Vivienne's expression sharpened. "The housekeeper is not a mother figure, Grayson. She's an employee." Grayson said nothing, which Vivienne interpreted, as she always did, as permission to continue. The women began appearing. The first was Claudine Beaumont, a senior partner at a Bay Street law firm, polished and precise, who arrived for dinner the following Friday in a silk blouse that probably cost more than Rosalind's monthly salary. She was charming to Grayson, correct with Poppy. She asked Poppy about school, then interrupted her answer to say something to Grayson about a restaurant she'd been to recently. Poppy watched her for the rest of the evening, with the expression of a scientist observing an unusual specimen. After Claudine left, Poppy appeared in the kitchen doorway while Rosalind was washing up and announced, "She asked me what grade I was in and then stopped listening." Rosalind, who had clearly heard every word of the entire dinner, did not look up from the sink. That's rude," Poppy said. Maybe she was nervous. Poppy considered this. She didn't seem nervous. She seemed like she was waiting for her turn to talk. Rosalind smiled very slightly, still not looking up. Bed, fine. The second was named Simone Vachon, who had made her money in commercial real estate and wore her hair in a sleek chignon that Poppy spent the entire dinner staring at. Simone brought flowers, for Grayson, not for Poppy, and talked at length about a renovation she was doing on her cottage in Muskoka. When Poppy asked if there was a lake, Simone said yes, and then added that the dock was being replaced, so it wasn't really a swimming situation at the moment, before returning immediately to the kitchen tile she'd had imported from Portugal. Later, while Grayson was walking Simone to the door, Poppy whispered to Rosalind, who was clearing plates. She talked about her house for 30 minutes. "It's a very nice house, apparently," Rosalind said. "She didn't ask me one question. Some people aren't sure how to talk to kids." Poppy thought about it. "You asked me questions on the first day, even when you didn't know me." Rosalind paused, just for a second, before stacking the next plate. "Go brush your teeth, bug." Poppy went. But she filed that information away with the careful seriousness of someone who does not forget things. The third was Marguerite St. Pierre, who Vivienne considered the strongest candidate and had mentioned no fewer than 4 times. Marguerite was 43, a former diplomat turned non-profit director, genuinely intelligent and possessed of the kind of easy elegance that made other women feel slightly underdressed. She was wonderful at dinner. She asked Poppy thoughtful questions and actually waited for the answers. She laughed at exactly the right moments. She and Grayson talked for 2 hours about things that mattered. Grayson thought, this might actually work. Poppy thought something different, but she didn't say it at dinner. What happened was this. 3 days after Marguerite's visit, Rosalind was in the backyard helping Poppy with a school project, a small terrarium that was supposed to simulate a forest ecosystem. They were crouched over a plastic bin, debating whether the moss was too wet when Rosalind's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Something changed in her face, and she said, very quietly, "Give me 2 minutes, bug." She stepped to the far end of the yard and took the call. Grayson was working at the kitchen table and could see them through the window. He wasn't listening. Then he was. He heard through the partially open window, I know, but I can't make that work right now. I've told you. I'm fine. Please stop calling the house, Mum." A pause. "I know he's sick. I know, but I have a job, I have commitments," and another pause. "I'll figure it out. I'll call you Sunday." She came back to Poppy and crouched down again and picked up the moss and said, "I think we need to dry it out a bit first. What do you think? Does it look like the forest floor?" Poppy looked at her carefully. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. You don't look fine. You look like how Dad looks when he's pretending." Rosalind looked at her for a moment and then she laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised. "I'm okay," she said. "I just have some stuff going on with my family, but I'm okay. Is someone sick?" "My dad. But he's going to be fine. He's very stubborn." "Dad says stubbornness is a survival strategy," Poppy said. "Your dad," Rosalind said, "is occasionally correct." Grayson stepped away from the window. He wasn't sure why he felt something he didn't have a name for. He told himself he hadn't been listening. He went back to work. That night, after Poppy was in bed, he found himself in the kitchen making coffee he didn't need, and Rosalind was writing something in her notebook at the kitchen table, which was a habit she had. She kept a small spiral notebook and occasionally wrote things in it. He didn't know what, and it had never seemed like his business. "Your raw father's not well," he said before he thought better of it. She looked up, not startled, just steady. "He's stable. Cardiac issue. He's in London, Ontario, not England. I go on weekends when I can. You don't have to tell me if it's okay. It's just one of those things." She paused. He worked in construction for 30 years, and apparently his heart didn't get the memo about retirement. "That's a long drive, London." "About 2 hours." She closed the notebook. "It's fine. I manage." She said it in the same tone she said most things. Matter of fact, not looking for anything from him. Which, for reasons he could not have explained in a boardroom, made him feel slightly worse about himself. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. He went upstairs and stared at the ceiling for a while. The situation with Marguerite came to a head on a Saturday afternoon in January. Vivienne had orchestrated a second meeting, a lunch at her house, presented as a casual family thing, which meant it was neither casual nor family. It was, as Grayson understood 10 minutes in, an evaluation. Vivienne wanted to see how Poppy responded to Marguerite in a different setting, away from the dinner party formality of their house. Poppy was polite. She answered questions. She sat up straight and used her napkin correctly because she knew her grandmother was watching. But she was quiet in the way that Grayson, who had begun to learn the language of his daughter's silences, understood meant something. On the drive home, he waited for about 4 minutes. Then Poppy said, from the back seat, in the careful voice she used when she was choosing her words, "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Sure. Are you going to marry Marguerite?" Grayson glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Where did that come from? Grandma keeps saying she's wonderful. And you've had dinner with her twice. And she's going to be at the thing in February." "I'm not making any decisions about anything," he said. "I'm just getting to know people." Poppy was quiet for another block. "She's fine," she said finally. "I just don't know if she actually likes kids. Or if she's just good at talking to them. There's a difference." "Yes," Poppy said, with the certainty of someone who has been a child her whole life and knows exactly how adults behave when they're performing versus when they mean it. "There's a big difference." Grayson didn't say anything. They drove another 2 blocks. Snow was falling lightly, the orange glow of the streetlights making it look amber. "Who do you think actually likes kids?" he said. He wasn't sure why he asked it. He already knew what she was going to say. "Rosalind," Poppy said without hesitating. "She never talks down to me. She doesn't get that face adults get when they've run out of things to say to you and they're waiting for you to go away. She's just always actually there." A pause. "Also, she fixed my terrarium when the mold got bad, and she didn't even make me feel bad about the mold." Grayson said nothing for the rest of the drive. The problem, and it was a problem, he made himself think of it as a problem rather than a revelation, because revelations were inconvenient, was that he had started noticing things about Rosalind that he had been determinedly not noticing for months. The way she talked to Poppy, yes, Poppy had said it better than he could, but also the way she didn't perform cheerfulness. A lot of people, when working in someone else's home, performed a kind of relentless pleasantness that Grayson found exhausting. Rosalind was pleasant, but she was also honest. When Poppy's terrarium did fail, she said, "Well, that didn't work," and they started over. When Grayson's Thursday morning schedule conflicted with Poppy's doctor's appointment, Rosalind said, plainly, "I can take her, but you should probably be there," and she wasn't wrong. She had opinions. She didn't state them constantly, but when she had one, she said it. When he'd mentioned casually that he was thinking of sending Poppy to a different school next year, more academic, better networks, Rosalind had looked at him evenly and said, "She loves her teacher, and she has her first real best friend this year. Is the academic case strong enough to outweigh that?" He'd been mildly annoyed. He'd also, after a week, decided she was right. He did not know her last name for the first 3 months she'd worked for him. He'd had to look it up in the agency files. He told himself this was normal employer-employee distance. Then February arrived, and 2 things happened within 1 week of each other that rearranged everything. The first was this. Vivienne announced a dinner at a restaurant downtown, to which she invited Grayson, Marguerite, several family friends, and, in what she presented as an afterthought, Poppy. Poppy came. She was wearing the blue dress she'd chosen herself, with the small embroidered flowers along the collar that Catherine had bought for her the year before she died. She sat beside Grayson and was perfect. Polite, attentive, everything a grandmother could want. Until the dessert course, when one of Vivienne's friends asked Poppy whether she was excited about the possibility of Marguerite being part of the family. It was an awful thing to say to a 7-year-old. The friend meant well. That made it worse. Poppy looked at the woman very carefully, and then looked at Marguerite, and then looked at her father. And she said, in a very small voice, "I don't know." The table went quiet. Vivienne made a smooth recovery, redirected the conversation, and the moment passed. But Grayson saw the look on Poppy's face. Not embarrassed, not upset, just terribly, honestly uncertain, and something in his chest moved in a way he was not prepared for. He thought about what Poppy had said. She's just always actually there. He thought about the peanut butter sandwich. He thought about the call through the window, "I'll figure it out." The way she'd said it like she'd been figuring things out her whole life and expected to keep doing so. He thought, for the first time, about what it would mean if Rosalind left. The second thing that happened was simpler and more embarrassing. He came home late on a Wednesday, genuinely late, after 10, and Rosalind was supposed to have gone. She wasn't staying over, she wasn't that kind of arrangement. But when he came through the door, the kitchen light was on, and she was still there. He stopped in the doorway. "Poppy had a hard night," she said. "She was upset after school. Something happened with her friend. I don't think it's serious, but she needed to talk and it ran long. She's asleep now. I wrote it down." She pushed a small piece of paper toward him on the counter. "The short version is her friend Nadia said something that hurt her feelings, and she doesn't know how to bring it up. She might need you to ask about it in the morning." He picked up the paper. It was in Rosalind's handwriting, clear and slightly slanted. It had the summary, and then below that, in parentheses, "She also really wanted hot chocolate with mini marshmallows, so I made some. The good cocoa is in the third cupboard from the left. She'll tell you it's better when you make it, so please make it when she asks." He stood there in his coat, holding this piece of paper, and felt, very suddenly, that he had been asleep for 3 years, and had just been gently, firmly woken up. "Why did you stay?" he said. "You didn't have to." She looked at him the way she sometimes did, not unkindly, but without softness either. Like she was deciding what was honest. "Because she needed someone to stay," she said. "And you weren't here." He should have said sorry. He should have said thank you. What he said was, "Rosalind, sit down." She raised an eyebrow. "I was actually just leaving." "Please," she sat. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, which felt very strange after months of them circling the edges of the same space without ever really occupying it at the same time. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For treating you like you were part of the house." She was quiet for a moment. "I am, in a sense, part of the house. That's the arrangement." "That's not what I mean, and I think you know it." She didn't deny it. "Your father," he said. "How is he?" She blinked. "Just slightly. Better. He had a procedure last month. It went well." "You never said. You never asked." There it was. He didn't argue with it. He'd had whole meetings with portfolio managers that were more personal than his conversations with this woman who had been inside his house every day for 4 months. "I'm going to ask now," he said, "if that's okay." She looked at him for a long moment, and he was aware, in a way he hadn't let himself be before, that she was a person of considerable depth, that there was a great deal happening behind her steady eyes that he had not bothered to wonder about, and that this was, if he was honest, his own failure more than anything else. "His name is Lawrence," she said after a moment. "He worked construction his whole life, came here from Abuja in 1989. He's proud and difficult, and he doesn't like hospitals, and he waited too long to go in." A pause. "He's also the funniest person I've ever met. He does this impression of my uncle trying to navigate a GPS that is genuinely one of the best things in the world." Grayson found himself smiling. "He's going to be fine," she said. "He's stubborn, like Poppy said." "Poppy told him that?" "She called him. Last week." Rosalind looked slightly amused. "I hope that's okay." She wanted to tell him that stubbornness was a survival strategy, and she thought he should know. Grayson sat with that for a second. His 7-year-old daughter had called his housekeeper's sick father to tell him to keep fighting. He said, with a care that was unfamiliar in his voice even to himself, "I think I've been a terrible employer. You've been an adequate one. That's not a compliment." "No," she agreed, "it's not. I'd like to be better at this, at being actually present." He paused. "At asking." She studied him for a moment. Then she said, with a kind of directness that he had come to understand was simply who she was, "Why are you telling me this? Because I'd like you to stay. Not just in the arrangement we have. I'd like you to stay because..." He stopped. Started again. "Poppy said you're always actually there. I want Poppy to have people in her life who are actually there, and I want to be one of them. And I think..." He set his hands flat on the table. "I think I'd like to know you. As a person. Not as a file from an agency." Rosalind was very still. Then she said, "You know this is complicated. I know. I work for you. I know that too. And your mother has apparently curated a whole roster of more appropriate options." "My mother," he said, "is not 7 years old, and therefore I'm giving her slightly less decision-making authority on this particular question." Rosalind looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the table. Then she made a sound that was almost a laugh. "That's possibly the most roundabout thing I've ever heard." "I'm better in writing," he said. Balance sheets don't talk back. Everything in your life must talk back. Everything that matters, he said. She went home. But she sat there for a few seconds first, and in those seconds something had changed. Not declared, not decided, but shifted, like ice going soft in March, in the particular way that Ontario winters end. Not all at once, but undeniably. Vivienne was not pleased. This was expected. She called on a Thursday morning, her voice carrying the particular restraint of a woman who had prepared her argument carefully, and said, "Grayson, I want you to think about what you're doing." "I've been thinking about very little else," he said. "She's your employee. She's a person who happens to work in my house. You have a daughter who needs stability, a family, a structure that makes sense. Poppy chose her," Grayson said. He hadn't planned to say it's quite like that. But once it was out, it was exactly right. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole thing. Silence on the line. "Poppy is 7, Vivienne said. "Poppy is the smartest person in this house, and she always has been, and I should have been paying attention to her a lot sooner." He paused. "She didn't choose based on a balance sheet, Mom. She chose based on who showed up. Who listened. Who crouched down to her level on the first day and asked about the dinosaur." He paused again. "I'm learning from her." Vivienne was quiet for a long time. Then she said, with a different kind of weight, "Your father would have liked her," which was not a blessing, but it was the beginning of one. Spring came slowly, the way it does in Ontario, March pretending to be February half the time, the snow retreating in stages and then coming back to insult everyone for one final weekend in April. Through all of it, things changed in the way that real things change, not in a single moment, but in accumulation. Grayson started coming home for dinner. Not every night, but most nights. He put his phone in a drawer at 6 o'clock and left it there. He learned that Poppy had a specific system for how she organized her markers. By color family, not by color, which was apparently the correct way. And that she had opinions about which type of apple was acceptable that were non-negotiable. He learned that she still talked to her mother, quietly sometimes, when she thought no one was around. Not crying, just talking, updating her the way you update someone you love who's been away for a while. He cried about that, in his car in the parking garage at work, exactly once. Then he called his own mother, who was surprised to hear his voice on a Tuesday afternoon, and talked to her for 40 minutes about Catherine, about Poppy, about the way grief had made him narrow when he should have been going wide. Vivienne cried a little too. She would have denied it. Rosalind was in all of it, and none of it, the way people are when something is building slowly. She still worked in the house. The arrangement remained the arrangement, technically. But he asked her things now, actual things, not logistics. He asked about Lawrence, who was recovering well, and had apparently started doing the crossword every morning at the kitchen table, which Rosalind said was either a sign of mental sharpness or stubbornness, and probably both. He asked what she'd studied, international development, at Waterloo, with a minor in French literature that she mentioned so briefly he almost missed it. He asked what she'd wanted to do before life arranged itself differently. "I wanted to do aid work," she said, "overseas, but my dad got sick the first time when I was 24, and then I was here, and then it became the plan that replaced the plan. Do you regret it?" She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything. Some days, not the choice. Just the version of myself I didn't get to meet. He understood that completely. He had his own version he hadn't met. The one who'd slowed down when Catherine was still alive, who'd been home for bedtime more than he wasn't, who'd been actually there. That version of him had existed for a while. It had been waiting in the parking garage, probably. In May, he asked her to dinner. Not at the house, not as an arrangement. At a restaurant on King Street, on a Saturday evening, when Poppy was at a sleepover with Nadia. The friend situation had resolved itself, as 7-year-old friend situations mostly do, and there was no logistical reason to be in the same place. She said, "You know your mother will find out." "She'll find out from me," he said, "before she finds out another way." "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure about very little," he said, "but I've been sure about the wrong things for 3 years, and I'm trying a different approach." She smiled at that, a full one, not the small private smiles he'd been cataloging, without meaning to. "Okay," she said, "but I'm choosing the restaurant." She chose a small Haitian place on Dundas that he never would have found on his own, where the owner knew her by name and brought them something off the menu that wasn't listed and was extraordinary. They talked for 3 hours. He learned things he'd had no idea about, that she'd run a half-marathon the previous October, that she had a sister in Calgary who was a respiratory therapist, that she'd once briefly had a column in a university paper about urban food policy, that she found financial news genuinely interesting, which surprised him until she explained that her father's financial insecurity growing up had made money into something she needed to understand. She asked him real questions, too, not the social ones, but actual ones. Why private equity? Why not something that built things directly? He found himself being honest in ways he hadn't been in years. She walked herself to her car at the end of the night and said, "From the driver's side door, I had a genuinely good time. Is that a surprise?" "A little," she said, "but a good one." He said good night. She drove away. He stood on Dundas Street in the mild May evening, feeling something he hadn't felt in so long he'd forgotten what to call it. Clear, he thought. It felt like being clear. Vivienne came around in her own time, which was, in the end, quicker than he expected. It was a Sunday in June, the long kind of evening where the sun doesn't really set until 9, and everything turns golden for an hour before it does. They were all in Vivienne's backyard. Grayson, Poppy, Rosalind, Vivienne, and Lawrence, who had driven up from London to meet everyone, which had been Poppy's idea and which no one had been able to say no to. Lawrence Okafor was 63 years old, broad-shouldered and deliberate, with a voice like a cello and the particular authority of a man who had built things with his hands for decades. He had brought butter tarts from a bakery in London that he mentioned 3 times were better than anything available in Toronto, and he held his own in conversations with Vivienne about real estate and the city's changing neighborhoods with such unself-conscious confidence that Vivienne, by the end of it, was clearly charmed and slightly annoyed about it. Poppy had claimed Lawrence immediately, sitting beside him at the garden table and asking him detailed questions about construction methods that he answered with complete seriousness, as though they were colleagues. Rosalind watched this from a few feet away with an expression that was mostly tenderness and slightly helplessness. And Grayson watched Rosalind, and Vivienne watched Grayson, and then Vivienne looked away at the garden and was quiet for a moment. "She's good," Vivienne said quietly to Grayson. "She's actually good, I know," he said. "Your father would have liked her father. I know that too." Vivienne made a small sound. Then she picked up her glass of iced tea and changed the subject to whether Poppy should be in a different swim class level, which meant the moment was over. But the moment had been enough. The last thing that needed to happen happened in July. Lawrence was back in London, doing well, complaining about the crossword getting easier. The house had found its rhythm. Poppy had started calling Rosalind by her first name even in front of other adults, which she had not done before. She'd always been careful, formal in front of strangers. But she stopped doing that somewhere in June and nobody commented on it, and it felt, in its own way, like a small flag being planted. Grayson and Rosalind were sitting on the back porch on a Thursday evening, Poppy asleep inside. The summer dark finally descended, the city giving off its distant hum. He'd been saying something about a deal that had fallen through. She'd been saying something about Lawrence's crossword performance, and then the conversation had gone quiet in the comfortable way that conversations go quiet when there's nothing left that needs to be said immediately, and neither person wants to leave. "I want to say something," Grayson said, "and I'd like you to hear it out before you say anything." She looked at him. "I spent 3 years being efficient," he said. "I was very good at efficiency. I outsourced the things I couldn't manage, and I told myself that was responsible. And for most of it, I think I was keeping things going. I was keeping Poppy fed and housed and educated, and that was real. That wasn't nothing. But I was so far from actually here." He paused. "Poppy figured it out before I did. She figured out what she needed and she made it clear the way kids do without ever saying it directly. And I finally listened. And what she needed, what I needed, was someone who showed up." He stopped. He was not a man who was good at this, and she knew it, and she was watching him try, and he thought that might be enough to make it real. "I've never said thank you for staying that night. For the note, for the cocoa instructions." Rosalind was quiet for a moment. "That was just," she started. "It wasn't just anything," he said. "Please let me finish." A breath. "I'm not saying this because you work here. I'm saying it because you're the most honest person I've encountered in years, and I find that genuinely remarkable, and I would like very much for you to be in my life in whatever way makes sense. Not as an arrangement, as a choice. The city hummed. A streetcar went by somewhere, its bell ringing once, distant and clear. Grayson, she said, and the way she said his name, not his last name, not Mr. Merritt, just his name, like it was ordinary, like it was hers to say, was the whole answer before she said anything else. Yeah, she said. Me too. It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a movie ending. It was a Thursday night on a porch in Toronto, two people choosing, plainly and without performance, to keep showing up. Poppy, who had appeared at the porch door approximately 30 seconds before either of them noticed, said, "Are you guys finally done being weird about this?" Grayson turned. "Were you listening? Dad, I've known since February." She yawned elaborately. "Can I have cocoa? It's 10 o'clock, one marshmallow." Rosalind was already standing up. "Deal," she said. "But you're going straight back to bed after." "Rosalind says the good cocoa is in the third cupboard from the left," Poppy said, following her inside. "I know," Grayson said, following them both. She wrote it down. The kitchen light came on. The city went on humming. And inside the house on the quiet Toronto street, for the first time in a very long time, everyone who needed to be there was exactly where they were supposed to be.